And we're in. It worked.
Yay!
Twitch worked. OBS worked. Just waiting for it to all fall over. No, it's fine.
Works.
It's fine.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Space at the Table. I am, first of all, I'm very sorry for us having to reschedule this one, but unfortunately, we decided to click go live at the exact moment that Twitch had a huge falling down. So we're kind of relieved because it wasn't our fault, but also it was kind of frustrating. But thank you very much for bearing with us.
In the words of Han Solo, it's not my fault.
No, they shot first. Wait.
Yes, exactly.
Anyway, but yeah, thanks again for joining us. Just for those of you who don't know, or if you have not come across the show before, this is part of the Some Other Heroes channel, and we committed to doing things that give back and add some benefit to our community, sharing some of the knowledge that we have, some of the experience that we have. And so we created this regular live stream open discussion series, which will have a range of guests on it, not just Chris and I, about storytelling, diversity, and creativity within Dungeons & Dragons and TTRPGs as a broader sense. This is actually the first of 3 we're going to be doing this month. So we'll tell you a couple of a few details about that at the end. But we have 2 more coming up this month, which are really cool. And this one obviously is our rescheduled one. Other than that, please bear with Chris and I if we are a little croaky, as we both appear to have colds at the moment. So apologies for that, but that's what happens when you hang around and do social things. Never again. Not true. So we are here today to talk about homebrewing and building your own world. So I wanted to give you just a little bit of information about how this came about as a topic for us to talk about. Hey, Joshy.
Hey, thanks for the raid, Josh, and it's lovely to see you. Thank you for coming.
Indeed. So how this came about. So basically, a little bit of sneaky information for you. Is that at the beginning of next year, it looks like, because we haven't confirmed a date, we will be launching a second original homebrew campaign on Some Other Heroes channel. A campaign that will be DM'd and written by me, which is exciting and ever so slightly terrifying. And in starting the process of putting together this campaign, although it is set in the same world as the current Some Other Heroes main campaign, it is set many centuries before. And so it's a very different world in many ways. And I was very excited about it, and then sat down to start putting the campaign together and realized that I was really scared and didn't know where to start. Because so far, all of my DM experience has been using existing campaign books and stories and source materials, which I really loved doing, but did find it a little frustrating in that there are times I wanted to go off book and kind of explore things with characters, but didn't know how to do it within that context. So we decided we're going to do something where it gives me the opportunity to really create that world. So I'm really excited about that. But we started having conversations. Chris has obviously built a number of worlds, and over the years he has done so much storytelling and created all these worlds in his head and in games. And in trying to get some information from him to help me kind of get started on this, I realized that it was probably a conversation that could be really interesting for other people to hear, because it would have helped me a long time ago. And so I thought it'd be really exciting for us to just ask some of the questions I was asking as a new DM, and hear what Chris has to say about it, take your questions, and that's basically why we decided to do this.
Yeah, and this is by no means comprehensive. This is my experience, and based on most of the sort of questions that we've had coming back and forth. Every DM will probably have their own experiences, and your experiences will change as you learn and you engage with other people as well. But if this helps a little bit for people who are, you want to jump into it for the first time, or if you want to just kind of get a different perspective on people that on how other people do it, then if we can help, we would love to. I mean,
it's not nerve-wracking at all, knowing that there are, in fact, great storytellers and DMs in the chat right now who have their own way of doing it.
but we'll come to that, at a future time, maybe.
Indeed.
But what Wayne is kind of touching on is the fact that even actually it's one of the things that we can talk about is that um, even when you are building something with an existing setting, you can still put your own spin and flavor to it as well. So this kind of will open up a dialogue on what that sort of looks like as well. So yeah, so I
The last thing just to mention is that the stuff we talk about today and the information that we get from the questions that people have sent us and that kind of thing, we're actually going to put together into a free download for everybody to take away as a kind of reference, and so that it might be helpful for people going forward. So that'll be available to download tomorrow. So keep a look on our socials and we will let you know when that's available. And in there, we'll also give you a list of a few online resources that we've kind of come across that may be helpful for you in terms of world building. And if you have any suggestions for those kind of resources, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And we'll add them to the PDF for you guys to download tomorrow.
amazing.
So, shall we start?
I think that's a good question as well, isn't it?
Well, to be fair, that's kind of where this all came from, was me having a slight panic and just going, where do I even start? So, where do I start, Chris?
Well, the first thing you need to sort of really decide is, well, first of all, before anything else, you need to decide whether this is an ongoing big campaign or whether this is a one shot or something like that. But the thing you need to sort of really decide is what sort of themes and story you want to tell. Do you want to kind of look at this from a perspective of you kind of want to choose a setting that you know but adapt it to what you want to play, or do you want to kind of create something entirely new outside of your existing experience? Do you want to build a world from the start up, or do you want to kind of just make it up as you go along? But one of the things I will always say to you is like, choose your themes, decide what sort of story you want to tell. So is this a dark story? Is this a grimdark fantasy adventure, low magic with maximum consequences? Is this a high fantasy superhero take on things where death is improbable, but everyone ends up with very powerful spells and near godlike abilities? Is this a very personal set of stories about a small group of people who are just trying to find a space in the world that they exist in? Sometimes that will be dictated by the system you're using. For example, unlikely to be a high fantasy cyberpunk red game that you're playing, but you never know. Go crazy. The other thing I would probably always say that is talk to your players. If you know who you're going to be playing with, sit down and talk to them, because one of the best ways you can have a buy-in with whoever you're going to be playing with is if they have a say in what's going on. If they have things that they really want to touch upon, for example, so the Some Other Heroes crew all have very different, slightly different approaches to how they play and what their experience is and things like that. They were all very, very kind to let me go crazy with Erevis and just run with it and just join me for the ride. But even then, there were conversations about in session zeros about what your character's position in the world is, how personal your story is going to be, even things like are they going to be grand romance in these stories, or is this a romance-free zone?
Yeah. I think the other thing that struck me is one of the games that you play in, Chris, when you were playing with Jonathan,
Yes.
was just this. When you were telling me about the campaign, I had never really sort of thought about the idea that there would be campaigns where the themes were so very much based on just survival. And it kind of felt really weird because initially I was like, that's terrible. Like, why would you do that? Like, your whole thing is about finding food and water. But actually, that, I guess, comes back to deciding on the theme, because if that is your overall theme, then you can kind of fill it in with the world.
Yeah, to clarify, Donathan Fry, who's an amazing DM and a really lovely guy, and if you ever get an opportunity to play with him, he does open his tables on a regular basis. I would recommend you do so. He's excellent. He runs a lot of traditional, old school D&D in worlds like Dark Sun and Kryn and Spelljammer, but makes them much more like the second edition using fifth edition rules. Uh, and I loved his Dark Sun game, but I struggled because I am not a fan of survival based. I like stories and I like getting to the point, and sometimes I think I came away going, I've literally just spent 2 sessions moving 2 hexes on the board. And it's been really interesting, but actually, I just want to get to the story bit now.
I mean, it's not that different from spending, 2 sessions shopping for hats, which is a distinct possibility with some
That
players.
that is true.
In terms of themes and things like that, are you talking about also like what the players want and how their characters interact? But are you talking about like um, sort of, is it a world of magic, or is it a world of
Yes.
technology, or is
Yes.
it those kind of things as well?
Yeah. So what do you guys want? Do you want steampunk? Do you want high technology? Do you want magic that's so advanced that it is like technology? Do you want none of that? Do you want it to just kind of be serfs and humans in the mud? Because sometimes those games can be really good fun as well.
Well, and I guess whether it's also sort of political intrigue, or whether it's
Yeah.
a heist, like we've talked about stuff like that
Yeah.
sometimes, where we're like, do you feel like doing a heist, or do you feel like doing a kids on bikes kind of theme? And that,
Yeah.
I think, I guess the interesting thing for me is that I'd never considered that you could take your theme and create a world, or a kind of a game around that theme. For me, it always felt like, wait, I have to build a whole world first. But it feels like it'll be easier to kind of think about the theme and then shape your world and
Yeah.
even the actual environment around what works with the theme.
And that's my second point of advice, actually, especially for people who are newer to world building and that. Start small. Don't try and build everything at once. It's incredibly overwhelming. It's still overwhelming for some of us who kind of have like decades of experience. We kind of, I need to create a new world. Well, start with a village or a town or a nation, and do it loosely as well. Like, do the things that are most immediately important to the characters first. And you can actually do that with your players. So if your players, when they're kind of working on their backstory and things like that, come to you and say, "Hey, I've got this idea for this character who lives in this place," you're like, "That's where we're starting our adventure." Or would you mind starting it here? This is where I'm planning on building my story from, and then you can populate that small location and have a couple of smaller adventures whilst people are kind of finding their feet there, and then you can start expanding it out a bit
Yeah,
more.
I was just looking in the chat. Like Sweet says, I started with a single city 6 years ago, and it just grew as the players explored.
Absolutely fine.
And
Yeah,
Hedge also said, they started with the first village and let it move from
yeah.
there. And that feels a little less daunting than world building to start
Well,
with.
a village is a potential of a couple of hundred NPCs as opposed to several million, which a world has, and and all those sorts of rules and regulations and stuff. And if you do have an idea for something whilst you're doing that, kind of go, jot it down. Make sure you're just kind of keeping an eye on those sorts of ideas so that you can breathe into them later.
I mean, I like the idea when I was thinking about the starting with a village or a town or an encounter or whatever. What I did like about it was this idea of, it feels less overwhelming to think, okay, in this village, who would be there? And you have all the kind of typical, you have a shopkeeper and you have a tavern and whatever. But then, when you were talking to me, I started thinking about like, well, who are like the colorful characters? Who's the town gossip? And, who's the one that has like wants to be the mayor but isn't? And who's the
Mm-hmm.
mayor? And is he effectual or not? And it feels so much more manageable than starting with, so what's the plot and where does everything end?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that feels really daunting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And actually, I think that's probably my next question is, like, when you build a world like this, do you know what the end is? Do you start by figuring out the ending? Like, is that a way to work towards it, or does it evolve as you create the story?
Yeah, sometimes. which is a really loose and amorphous answer, I know. And as Sweet says, no end sandbox. Sometimes my games are like that. Sometimes I have an idea of a story I want to tell, but what I would say is do what gives you passion, what you're excited about. So if you want to do like a free plot story arc where you kind of have a beginning, a middle, and end, do that. But leave yourself open about it, because if you are so focused on those sorts of plot, that's where railroading can happen without you even meaning to do so. And
Yeah,
railroading, for anyone who doesn't know, is when you kind of push people down a particular type of plot and don't give them much autonomy as players, and that's not always fun for people. Um,
I think that, I mean, that is a question that we had kind of later on. Excuse me, was that I had to say it's something that I considered was this idea of how do I move my players along the story I want them to pursue without railroading them.
mhm.
Because as I know from being a player, it's very easy to go off track for a long time if the DM lets you. And so that feels like quite daunting, because an existing setting where you're working to a book, it's kind of easy to bring it back in. But on your own, it's kind of, you have to figure that out. And I think, we'll talk a little bit about that later on.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But I think getting people into and then back into the plot is a real kind of point of contention or point of nervousness for me.
Yeah, no, and I think it is something that you will get more comfortable with as you kind of move on and you become more experienced. But the answer is just, well, actually, one of the simple answers for all of this is just remember this is supposed to be fun. This is you playing with your friends, and if you screw up or make a mistake or have to retcon something, hold your hands up and just go, hey, this happened. Actually, I want it to be like this. Is that okay? Just check you're not kind of stepping on any player autonomy, and then move forward with things as they should be from there on.
Would you please leave the bread shop? That kind of thing. Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing that does feel like a bit of a relief is when you were saying about, it's a collaborative storytelling
Mhm.
game. That's the term people keep using for this. And like you said to me, use your players. If
Yeah.
they say their character comes from a fishing village, then ask them what they see the fishing village as being as, or whatever, and then you build that little bit of your world by getting them to help you build it. And that feels, that kind of felt good to me, because it felt like it wasn't all just me having to create things and come up with everything.
Well,
Drawing them in was really good.
Well, I mean, every single one of the characters in some other heroes have important NPCs that the players have come up with. And then what I've done is I've stitched them into the larger world afterwards. So Theo came to me and said, hey, I want Eugene to be the son of a famous adventurer. And I was like, excellent. And then gave me some names and some ideas. And I was like, brilliant. This is who he is. This is what he did. This was what, 20 years ago. You came to me and you're like, I escaped from this family at this time, and I went on and I did this. And from that, I got both the Revorkas clan, and I got Julie and her Carnival of Curiosities.
Yeah,
Two really big things that have happened in the game, which came from your ideas.
yeah.
All I had to do was just flesh those out. Ashling, we haven't touched, other than, I mean, obviously Alabaster,
I mean, kind of a thing.
we haven't touched on some of the other smaller things, but they have been already hinted at, and kind of, and at some point when you go somewhere, you're going to meet some of the people that Ashling knows, and
Yeah,
you'll find out a little bit more about Ashling's history at that point.
yeah. I think because the idea of creating, like, even with us, just creating the three places that our characters came from
Yeah,
suddenly means you have three places in the world almost done,
yeah, absolutely, and
or
I
at least
mean,
starting.
and as you know from our discussions, like Belwa, where Rock comes from, came along later. We just knew
Yeah,
that House Revorkas was somewhere in the Empire. Well, now when I was creating the Empire in a more tangible sense, because it became a more important part of the story, doing it later when it became important, and I needed to have names to give people, as opposed to in session one, driving
yeah,
myself mental trying to build a whole world. Um, I needed to give a nation name for the area that the Revorkas control, which is
yeah.
Belwa. There is an island you are going to meet at some point, which is something to do with Aisling, which is very important to
It's a
her.
prison, isn't it?
It's a prison, yeah.
Which kind of segues nicely into the next question I had, which was on a very practical level. How do you create the actual maps? Like, how do you really start by creating a map? Like, where do you start? What do you do first?
Loose idea to start with. And this is my style. I'm very loose, and then I kind of make more details as it all comes more closely together. So I would kind of dictate what I want in those areas, and then I would kind of build it on there from there. One of the best maps I've made, I cheated a little bit. Have to admit that. Cloud's Cairn, I created using a free city creator by someone called about to, and I will just if I can find it.
Well, we'll add that into
Yeah.
the PDF so everyone can get to it anyway.
And they have on itch.io they have a lot of little generators. So what you do is you go in, you create your map, you kind of juggle it around a little bit, and then change the names based on what you want. So Cloud's Cairn was built out of, this is roughly the sort of shape, and these are the sort of areas. Okay, and what am I going to call those areas? Cloud's Cairn was the first place you were going to be, so it was more important that that was mapped out. And then I did the islands based on some of the things that I had talked to each of your characters about, each of you as players and your characters about previously.
So you didn't have the whole kind of world fleshed out.
No, I knew the major politics. So I knew that there was the Empire. I knew that Ashur existed. I knew that Daklan existed. I knew that Cloud's Cairn was part of a conglomerate of free cities. I didn't even know all the free cities at that point. I kind of had made up 2 others at that point. Now there's many more. So yeah, it's just it was more along the lines of, when I was thinking about Cloud's Cairn, it's like, who is Cloud's Cairn run by? Well, it's run by a mayor, an elected official who has actually been elected for the best part of 200 years, which is Rebecca Ryder.
Yeah.
It's unprecedented how regularly she gets voted back in. Okay, who are their allies? Well, they have a very soft relationship because they are wedged literally between Daklan and the Empire. They have a small set of islands that they control. So some of them are farming communities, some of them are little land spaces, some of them are literally just floating rocks that they have to keep an eye on just in case they drift too far away. Those sorts of things.
And I guess if you start with one small place, then you can kind of figure out actually what would be to the north, south, east, and west, and then kind of build it from there.
What are the immediate tangible? What are the immediate things that the players can access from?
And I guess going back to what you said before, if you know what your themes are, that can then shape the geography. Because if it's a world of lush adventure and jungles and tombs, and then that kind of dictates what you would then sort of how you would shape the actual environment of the world.
Yeah. And I will be honest, I am terrible at judging distances between different places. My brain just does not work that way. And I have no idea how long sometimes it takes. So I abstract a lot of it. It's one of the reasons that we don't do a lot of, this is definitely a peek behind the screen. It's one of the reasons that we don't do a lot of travel stuff. One, I don't find it particularly interesting, either as a DM or as a player.
To do the whole kind of roll each day,
sort of things like that. I just, particularly when we're doing something like Some Other Heroes, in home games I think it works better, but if you're doing something like Some Other Heroes, it can really slow narrative down and stop what we're doing. And I know that you and I have played in games where that's kind of happened a lot, and we've been like, this isn't working for us. I'll come to that again in a second if you remind me. But it is important to kind of have an idea that, it's going to take a week to get there. It's going to take 2 weeks to get here, that sort of thing. But I'm terrible at kind of gauging those speeds and things like that. So I just abstract it a lot of the time.
But as you said to me about a couple of things, was if you make it up and you say, okay, that's going to take you 4 days,
yeah,
just
Jot it
write
down.
it down.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that then becomes part of your world, even though you've
Yeah.
made it up on the fly. You didn't have it prepared. It's now
Yeah.
part of your world,
As,
and
as
that
a
kind of makes sense.
as a famous player character once said, "Time is a soup."
Indeed.
Yeah, and going back to what I was saying, like if you, as a segue to that, if as a little sort of hint, if you're doing travel and you are doing that sort of travel, plot out, if you have the time to plot out in advance, rather than kind of going roll for each day, either roll beforehand if you feel that that's what you need to do, so you save time for your players each time, or have a chance for certain things to happen on certain days. And those are the days that they roll. So if you've got like 4 days of travel, roll once or twice. If you've got 2 weeks of travel, roll 4 times.
Yeah.
Most of travel is probably going to be a lot of sitting on the back of carts, nodding at farmers as you go past.
But the other thing, because I know we talked about the travel stuff before, and one
Yeah.
of the things that immediately for me, this idea of rolling for encounters, is I don't like the idea of like, okay, it's day 2, you roll, if you roll badly or you roll this number, then you fight a group of bandits. If you do that, you fight at this. Because I like this idea of kind of mixing it up, and it reminded me, for anybody who has played The Last of Us, the original game. There is a moment in that which is just one of the most amazing moments in the whole game, which is when they encounter these wild animals in this derelict city, and it's such an incredible moment, and I think it's because it is such a change to their usual pace. It's almost a moment of peace rather than sort of another battle. It's actually a moment out away from the battle and the travel. It's a moment of just peace and kind of looking at something that's really pretty. And so I think I like that idea of throwing in moments that aren't just battle encounters, but that might be just that they lose a few hours by stopping to watch a beautiful sunset or something.
I love that idea, and I also think that's very important in terms of like when you're creating narratives and stories, and that you do need peaks and troughs. You need quiet moments where characters can reflect. It can't all be go. We were watching something about horror games yesterday, and one of the ones that everyone said is, I can't remember what it's called, but one of the games that people were saying is one of the scariest out there. The narrator of the list said that basically she got bored towards the end because it was like, oh look, it's another jump scare. Oh look, it's another
Yeah.
piece of action. Oh look, I've got to do this again. And that's the case of, even in terms of writing something for D&D, and even in world building, like you've got to have nice areas to kind of with conflict, with darker, more disparate areas that kind of antagonize. So you've got to have like dark places when like evil gnolls or wild men hide and cause conflict, as well as open elven plains where you might meet fairy hobgoblins coming in on, well, for the Feywild, strange hobgoblins on stilts, kind of wobbling past on their
Indeed.
own. Yeah.
That makes sense. So, speaking of things like games and stuff, so one of the questions I had was, in terms of drawing ideas from different sources and things like that, how do I draw those ideas into this world I'm building without just copying things that have been done? How do I make sure that what I'm creating is original and fits my kind of story and isn't just lifted from somewhere else?
Um, it's a thing that we all do. I think acknowledge that some of it is going to happen irrespective of whether you mean it to or not, but always think about it as you are remixing other people's idea or reskinning
Mhm.
things that you love. And this is something we've talked about before. The scattered lands are based on various influences and things that I can tangibly like talk about. So in terms of aesthetic, Grand Blue Fantasy, if anyone is aware of that, is beautiful anime about skyships and floating islands, funnily enough. Final Fantasy III, which is all set in strange and mysterious lands where they kind of uncover more as they go on. There is a huge amount of influence of the Malazan books and Stephen Erickson's amazing world building. It's a big influence on my own writing. Like I love his approach to gods and deities, and like the fact that even as a god, you could be gone in 2 minutes' time if you're not careful. And that kind of also leans back into things like Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman, which is like gods need belief, and if you're not believed in, you stop being a god.
Yeah, and I do see that in your games. Actually, it's
Yeah.
kind of a thread with your deities. So, how do I do that with characters and stuff to kind of how do I remix them? Like, what kind of things can I do to make that?
Well, if you kind of we'll go to characters if you like, because we actually had a really interesting conversation about this. If in terms of lifting characters, have a reason for doing it. So, if you are a Tolkien fan and you absolutely adore Gollum, don't just lift Gollum. Think about what Gollum is and what Gollum represents. So, Gollum, who undoubtedly one of the most favourite characters from Tolkien's whole story arc, really important character. But the reason Gollum is so important is he's a dark reflection of Bilbo and Frodo. In both major stories he appears in, his whole purpose is to say, hey, if you don't control this situation, this is what's going to happen to you.
Right.
So take elements like that and then kind of lift it. So if you're like, okay, one of my players is a paladin, or a holy knight, or a high mage, who the other mages in the world kind of really sort of like look up to. What's the opposite of that? Is it someone who doesn't have control of their power, someone who's broken their oaths, someone who has like taken a darker path than your protagonists have? Those dark reflections are really useful in terms of creating antagonists that are fully fleshed out, and have a purpose. Like literally, kind of have a character that makes your player characters go, "Oh, that could be me."
Yeah.
Oh no. Yeah. The other thing as well, and this is something that I know.
Sorry, I really love what Hedge just said. Was
So-
take the essence, not the vanity.
Exactly. Yes.
I think that's a beautiful way of putting
Yeah.
it.
Absolutely lovely. Thank you for that, Hedge. That's really lovely. Another thing that coming off of that Lydia and Lydia from Wicked Game and I have talked about quite a bit is, and I think Josh, who's in chat, is a big fan of this as well. We absolutely adore villains as the heroes of their own story. Like, don't just make a mustache twirling evil for evil's sake. Always have a purpose for an antagonist, and just think it doesn't need to be like big sort of like psychological background and profiling. Just like three simple things, like the evil king that we're trying to overthrow. Does he think he's evil? Does he think this is, what is his goal? Here's like, why does he want more gold? Well, he wants more gold because he has a war on his borders, that he has little control over, but he must pay for more mercenaries. Does he look down on people below him? Is that because he's perpetually terrified that the people are going to rise up and overthrow him? So he's trying to get to them first because that's the way he was raised. Has he been corrupted by an external voice? Is there somebody else waiting in the shadows who actually is behind the whole plot?
Well, I mean, we've talked about this in connection with storytelling in everything from Marvel films to other stuff. Like the villains that are the most interesting are the ones that are not sort of just black and white, and it's kind of harder to see. It's harder to just instantly hate them outright because you start to understand that there is a rationale behind it that's almost human.
One of the cleverest things that the MCU ever did was making Thanos a relatable character.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that, apart from the chin, but
And Rooney, I saw that. And if you're having your romance game, yes, absolutely, the antagonist should be sexy and be conflicting. Um,
now the heroes are conflicted about killing them.
yeah,
I love that. In terms of sort of remixing and stuff like that, I know one of the things that kind of made sense to me was you were talking about picking scenes or the kind of vibe and the feel of things that you like in movies or other games or books or
yeah.
whatever, and then thinking about how that would fit in your world. Like, if you have a dogfight with you like the kind of dogfights from Star Wars. Like,
Hmm.
how can you create that in your world if you don't have space travel or whatever? Like, what's the equivalent that would give the same feel?
Oh, I mean, there's dragons in Erebus. If you guys want to go
Yeah.
dragon fighting as opposed to dog fighting, entirely
Wait. Like,
possible.
actually, okay, we're definitely doing that. Just saying.
And also, like, again, we come back to this whole sort of thing. Ask your players if they're like, "Hey, encourage your players to do this." Hey, I saw this really cool thing. I'd like to show you. Okay, go and have a look at it. It clearly means a lot to them. How can I remix that and put that into my world? And don't worry if this ends up being like this big stew pot and mixed flavors and things like that as well. Remember, you're still doing this for fun, um,
Well, and I
and
think if you come back to your themes, like you can kind of make it tie in somehow.
yeah,
If you come back to
exactly.
your themes, or if you shape it to the environment, like if your whole adventure, like one of the ones we have played, is set in a sort of Arctic wilderness,
Hmm.
then that would kind of dictate how you could spin those kind of things to fit with that environment. So it would be kind of unique to there.
Brilliant. Yes. So yeah, just like engage with your players. Don't be afraid to kind of absorb something, but always be aware that you are. Try and be aware that you're doing that, and just kind of put your own spin on things.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing, of course, is and you can like you can kind of change the way things work. And this is really good in terms of mechanics. If there is this idea you have for this monster or this creature, but you don't have exactly the right resources to kind of build that for yourself, delve into what's in your materials and reskin something. We talk a lot about D&D because, let's face it, the dragon game is still the biggest one out there, and a lot of us have come together through mutual love of it.
And it's what we do every Sunday.
Exactly. If there's not a creature that suits what I need and I don't have the time to create it, I will delve into some of the manuals. I'll find something around about the right difficulty level, and I will change elements of it that to suit what we're doing. It might be, I might take a demon stat block and make it more Arctic themed, or I might
Yeah.
Erebus with the scattered lands, there are a lot of things that I've taken that are oceanic that I have kind of changed to be flying creatures that exist in a flying
Right.
space. Yeah, just
I mean,
don't be afraid to do that. Yeah.
the other thing that the first time I saw your Kobold Press books,
Oh yes.
when you were looking through those, I have to say that was one of those things where I kind of hadn't really realized there was resources like that. And
Yeah.
so I think that's kind of one of the things that's quite exciting, is discovering that there are other resources you can pull things like monsters and creatures from to build
Yeah.
your world.
Have a look,
Um,
see who, whatever game you're playing, have a look to see who has created books who are not part of the main company. So if it's in Dungeons and Dragons, Kobold Press have created these creature codexes which are beautiful.
mm,
Not every creature in them works for me, but there are so many interesting and weird and wonderful things that you can really just throw in there as something different. Modiphius have a lot of setting agnostic stuff with creature ideas and things like that. And there's always DM's Guild or one bookshelf as
but
well.
you were saying the DM's Guild, there are resources in there from people who wrote the Dungeons and Dragons books. They've
Yes,
done like supplements.
yes. So there's expansions to the Monsters Manual, to More Than Kingdoms, Tome of Foes, and all sorts of other bits and pieces that the actual writing teams or associated writing teams within Wizard Coast have gone and released other things as well. So if you want to expand upon those, their PDFs are inexpensive. So they're a bit cheaper and a bit easier. You can mine on, for that, if you're looking for that sort of thing as well, you can mine on places like Reddit, where a lot of people post those sorts of ideas as free. I'm not a Reddit person myself, but I do appreciate that as a resource.
I mean, I have to say, when I was preparing for Witchlight, I had a brief look on Reddit, and it was a bit overwhelming just because there is so much there. But it did lead me to a Discord channel of people who were all running Witchlight games, and there was a lot of help in there. Of people just asking for help on how they can amend the world or how they can supplement and add,
Yeah.
or just things that didn't make sense. So
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
guess that could be a really good, good source of help.
Look, and we all know that the internet is a creature of two sides. But if
Well, yes.
if you know where you are and you know the communities that you're in, don't be afraid to ask those communities. I've always said that for our community, we may not be able to get back to you right away, but some other heroes, our DMs are always open.
Yeah.
So if you kind of like, hey, I need to find something. Do you have any ideas? Well, as soon as one of us can check our messages, we'll come back to you and let you know.
Yeah, I mean, most people are very happy to share anyway
Yeah.
if you ask them. One thing I did want to mention, you had talked to me before about the monster idea or the creature idea, where you said think about existing creatures
Mm-hmm.
and what they would look like to people who discovered them for the first time.
Oh
And
yes.
you had an example which I thought was hilarious.
I can never pronounce the name. Catapults. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Is a creature that many of you might be familiar with from Dungeons and Dragons. Actually has a mythological origin. It is interestingly represented as a one-eyed, large, fuzzy beast, and the term comes from Europeans going to Africa back in the period of the High Empire of Ethiopia and not understanding what a wildebeest was.
I love that idea. I do love the idea that this wildebeest that we know so well
Yeah.
now was once seen as. I mean, it's the same as the kind of mermaids and manatees thing.
Absolutely, exactly. Which, by the way, Josh, if you're still in chat, we need that as a game. Thank you very much.
Mermaids and manatees.
Mermaids and manatees.
Like it.
Think about like if you were a adventurer in our world going to somewhere completely different, how would you badly describe a creature you saw there, and then how can you turn that into something that's actually fun for your world? So go back to you're talking about the wild animals section in Last of Us. It's the giraffes. Well, think about this strange long-necked deer with these knobbled horns and this patchwork of fur which clings to it as it kind of looms over you with this straw-like neck. To anybody else,
I mean, they're pretty creepy now.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, not creepy. Weird. They're adorable.
They have tongues that can break a tree branch off with its power, and you're just like, suddenly that's a much more sinister creature.
This is true. Let's not turn nice giraffes into sinister.
No, giraffes. I mean, unless you're from Centaur World, giraffes are fine.
Let's not go down that rabbit hole either. So, another question with talking about how we pull things from other places and that kind of thing is, how do I stop myself, or how do I make sure that I don't fall into kind of using tropes, too many tropes or cliches, or because a lot of the materials we look for are kind of built on those. So how do I make sure that then it doesn't become things that's predictable for people?
Ooh. Well, first off, tropes are your friends. We're very frightened of tropes these days because we went through a period of media where everything became very tropey and the same stories are being retold and rehashed a lot of the time. But there is something very familiar and comfortable for people who lean into, who know tropes and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
A good example of this is hero's journey. There are so many stories that follow the hero's journey. You would all know it as Star Wars. the very first Star Wars film.
I mean,
Is
pretty
the
much
hero's journey.
most adventurous stories are based around
Yeah,
the hero story, which was an original kind of Joseph Campbell. He made it famous, which is
exactly.
basically
Yeah.
these 16 stages of the journey of a hero.
And nobody's expecting you as a DM to remember all of those stages and kind of make sure that they're there or not there, or you're kind of leaning towards or against them. One of the things I will say is you're not dealing with one single antagonist like you are in film and books. You're dealing with a group of protagonists who all of whom have
Yeah,
their own
true.
agendas and goals. But don't be afraid of tropes. Tropes can help guide your players. They can help kind of give them those wonderful aha moments, because they're kind of like, there's something familiar about this. I mean,
Yeah,
try not to be obvious about it. But there's actually a really good, I absolutely love Overly Sarcastic Productions.
yeah.
And
Which we'll also put the
yeah,
link in.
Red from OSP does a series of trope talks about different topics that are considered tropes. So things like the Lancer character, the best friend who's there to needle the hero, evil geniuses, MacGuffins, things like that. And they're good to listen to because you become a little bit more aware of what those things
Yeah,
are. And you're like, okay, yes, I can use this, but this is the obvious way they're going to do it. Like, I hate, and you know this for a fact, I hate big red buttons that solve problems. Doctor Who, one of the problems with the modern Doctor Who is not the characters or the stories. The problem is they write themselves into a corner, and it's always the Doctor has a big red button that he can press to save the day.
yeah. I mean, comics have done that for a while
Comics
as
have
well,
done
and
that as
it's
well.
always disappointing when comics do the whole, oh, but guess what? It was a different universe all
Yeah,
along. It's kind of the equivalent of it was a dream all along,
yeah,
which is
exactly.
it's just not satisfying.
Yeah, just be aware of tropes and cliches. Lean into them a little bit, and then go a step further. I mean, we were saying about the evil king earlier. Like, the evil king is such a wonderful trope. But again, we've already discussed, why is he that way?
Yeah.
What's causing that?
So look
Who's pulling the
underneath
string?
what kind of is below the cliche.
Yeah,
What
parting
drives.
the kimono, as Tom is very fond of saying. Sorry, excuse
But
me.
also, I think like what Hedge said about subverting the cliches, I
Yes.
think that also is something that I've seen work very well. I mean, people like Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett
Yes.
do that so beautifully, where they typically have these heroes that are the people you expect least, and equally they have armies of the smallest, meekest characters rather than the big characters, and they have terrifyingly huge characters that you would be afraid of if you saw them, and they're actually the really gentle, kind ones. And I
Yeah.
like that subverting of those kind of cliches. I think is still fun to play with.
And if you're doing something along the lines of the hero's journey, what would it look like if your hero, your protagonists for your player characters, were the support cast to someone else's hero's journey? What would that look like? What roles would they fit in? What is it important that they get this person from X to Z? I mean, go back to Star Wars. The most interesting character in the first Star Wars film is Han.
Oh yeah,
And by a long shot, and Han is not the hero of the story. He's just more interesting because he's got more of a background. He's more storied. Well, what if your party are there to get the equivalent of Luke from point A to point B, and it's your jobs to kind of make sure that he fits. There's an interesting story to be told there already.
yeah.
It's been done in media a few times, I'm sure. But yeah, just acknowledge the cliches, be aware of them, use them. One of the things you can do is, because not only will you be aware of them, your players will be as well.
Yeah.
So if your players are aware of them, they're expecting things. So at subverting something, as Hedge says, is very much a case of they're all expecting it to go this way. Well, it's not. It's going this way,
Yeah.
and that's where the exciting. George R. Martin kind of does this too much in a lot of respects.
But it's a bit like the jump scare thing.
Yeah, absolutely. But one of the things that was so good about those books when they first came out is we were all like, okay, it's going to be like this. And it's
Yeah.
like, oh no, it really isn't going to be like this. Like, he killed his main character off at the beginning of the first book.
Yeah.
Spoilers, by the way. Sorry about that.
You're supposed to say spoilers before you say it. Oh, well.
See, look, I subverted your expectations.
Speaking of things going off track, so here's a question that I don't think there is a simple answer to, but how do I make sure when I'm creating the story and the world, how do I make sure that the players get the clues or the information they need to kind of move the story forward without railroading them? Like, we talked a bit about railroading, but it's always one of those things where you want the players to do. I mean, some of the best moments are when they kind of go off on their own thing. But how do you make sure that by doing that, they don't miss out information that's kind of key?
So don't be precious about it. One of the easiest steps into railroading is being very precious with what you're trying to do and trying to control it. Your players are going to do things that you do not expect. They're going to jump off the back of dragons. They are going to go. They are going to go and confront two NPCs that are supposed to be just wandering off at this point.
They're going to ask for tea at inopportune
moments, and that's the fun of TTRPGs.
Yeah. I mean, that's what makes D&D and TTRPGs so much fun, is usually those moments. But that's always the kind of thing, is I've always wondered how you bring people back without it being very obvious that you need them to go and find that info.
So the thing is, and I mean, we kind of just went off a bit of a tangent ourselves there. The thing is remember, this is a living, breathing world, and if they miss the first clue, don't worry about it. But make sure that you make a note and kind of have a think about what that means for what's going on in the background of the world. If they didn't meet the NPC that you needed them to meet, where did that NPC go? What did they do? What is the knock-on effect for the greater plot? If that NPC was supposed to give them information about the evil Fey god that's rising up and they never met him, then okay. Who else knows that information? Who does that NPC talk to? Do they find that NPC dead later for the information that they have? Those are all, like, suddenly you've got all these new possibilities, and it's like, oh, hang on, who was this? What's their relationship to us? Or move on to the next clue. If they're going in a completely different direction, what's the next clue to what you're trying to tell them? What is the next event that along the ticking clock that is the big bad winning? So
I guess if you have, I guess the key is to make sure that there are multiple kind of breadcrumbs and clues, so that if they do miss one, there are still other things, but you could also probably throw that one back in somewhere.
Yeah, and also it's really good because suddenly, without sort of like wrapping their knuckles, it gives the player characters, the characters themselves, incentive. Hedge and Sweet just both made some really lovely. I love Sweets. The BBEG is still BBEGing even if you start a chicken farm. And Hedge just said, I destroyed a village once because players got sidetracked and ignored the hints that the village was in trouble. Perfect. Absolutely brilliant. It's like, horrendous for your players. They're like, oh my god.
That's all right. Sweet just took it one step further and said a war started because her players ignored a clue.
Absolutely fine. And do those sorts of things. Those are so much fun for you as a DM because you're writing your own little story in the background.
Yeah.
One of the things I did for your story is there are another group of adventurers who are contemporary to the players, and you don't encounter them often. They just occasionally bump into them, but each time you do, their story has moved on, and occasionally, particularly in the early episodes, they took missions you guys did not. So if you remember, they met an adventurer that Rock was familiar with who had lost his arm. They took the mission that Rock, Eugene and Aisling turned down, and it went badly for them because they were not prepared for it. I really like those sorts of encounters. So there's although I don't drive myself crazy with every single NPC has this very active living life in my head, because there's only enough room in here anyway. Key NPCs that they're going to meet, particularly if they're like, oh, I really like them, can we meet them again? It's like, well, yes, you can. This is what they've been up to whilst you were away.
Well, that actually segues nicely onto another question that we kind of had, was about how you make the world feel kind of full and believable. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was when this came in, you were saying is kind of create moments that your players don't ever see.
Yeah.
Like create those, and the thing you said was about who takes the path that you don't.
Yeah, I love that, and that's exactly what I was just talking about.
Yeah.
And just who does the things that you don't do? What are the impacts of that? It kind of ties back to that whole breadcrumbing as well. If this is one of those wonderful things that I'd like to go back in terms of go right back to the beginning when we were talking about sometimes you can just twist things on settings that you love.
Mm-hmm.
If you're very familiar with, let's say, Exandria, because you've watched all the Critical Role playthroughs and you're really familiar with the world that Matt's created and you found it very, very fleshed out and you really love it, no one's saying that you can't play in that. But let's have a think about it from a different perspective. What if, and say, for example, you want to set a game in Wildmount, what if the heroes in the campaign 2 never became heroes? What if the things that created their tragic stories was that was the end? They never rose to prominence. What does that world look like without Vox Machina, without the Mighty Nine in that particular instance? What if Vox Machina lost the battle with Vecna at the end of the campaign? If you want to build in those worlds, rather than trying to fit it in and kind of shape it to the world that's been created for you, play around with it a little bit, like twist it back on itself.
Yeah. Well, that idea of kind of what's going on in the world,
yeah,
while that's happening, what's going on somewhere else in the world, because it's a big world. And then you can use the existing setting as your kind of framework, which means you don't have to start from scratch.
Absolutely. And then suddenly you've got a completely new campaign with familiar settings, which people are going to be related to. But then you can also bring in NPCs that you love, but do that thing where you twist them a little bit. They're different, you know. Is Essex suddenly a hero of the realm for what he tried to do? You know, and those sorts of things. And you can do the same in terms of homebrewing as well. Is what's the expectation? What are the heroes missing? They're on their journey and they're playing their story, but what are they missing? What are they not seeing? What are the NPCs that they're meeting often doing by themselves? What are the politics? How are they moving on without everybody's attention? For example, Brock has not seen the Emperor in 20 years.
Yeah.
When he last saw the current Emperor, he was not Emperor. He was Regent Ascendant.
Yep.
Rock's depiction of that young man is very different from the man he might meet if he goes to the Empire at some point.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that thing of the world kind of exists, like you know, we were talking about basically creating the world, making it feel full by letting it like play without your players. Other things happen that your players don't see and are not kind of party to. And I think that comes nicely to what you mentioned about, you know, how I can create kind of surprises and plot twists for my players. And it's the same kind of thing where you said, you know, think about the fact that there are always two stories, two versions of events. There's the version that everybody knows or thinks they know, and then there's the version that really happened. And so, again, I think it's basically the same thing. It's subverting that idea. Everything people think they know, and then showing them what actually happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that could be the twist.
Yeah, and actually it's very rewarding for players who think they've understood something all the way through. When you do those twists or those changes, that they suddenly get a very different story, and then they might actually, depending on what breadcrumbs you've left them through the story, they might look back and go, "Oh no, we've known about this for a while. We didn't even realise." I love that sort of thing. I'm very big excited, and rumor and conjecture are big parts of any living world. We unfortunately very much know how media shapes things in our world. In your world, it could work exactly the same way. Like just because your nation tells it one way doesn't mean that another nation
Yeah.
sees it that way.
Well, and also that the clues and the breadcrumbs that the players might miss, if you need to get them to kind of find those things out, those can be, literally overheard in a tavern if it's something that you
Yeah.
really need them to hear, or it can be something that they, find out from a shopkeeper who's a gossip or something. Um,
Also, you kind of just spawned this idea, like how fun would it be to run a game where basically the player characters are actively trying to avoid getting involved and everything around them is just trying to direct them back at it, and it's just like how creative would they have to be to try and step ahead of something that could be a political powder keg where they're like, I don't want anything to do with this. Then, as Sweet puts it, those disappointing lost breadcrumbs suddenly become a point of humour. It's
yeah.
like, oh look, that's another thing we're going to avoid. But to answer Sweet, it can be incredibly disappointing as a DM where you're like, I gave you all these hints and you either ignored them or didn't pick up on them. Don't beat yourself up about it. Anything can happen. There's an ongoing meme about Bobbling the Goblin being the most exciting thing that anyone's ever met. And it happens because you might suddenly, off the whim, create a NPC that everyone's like, I'm really, really invested in this character. Okay, roll with it. Those things still happen in the background. The fact that they're so busy chasing Boblin the Goblin around and trying to emancipate his people is a completely different story and can lead to some new adventures. Just roll with your players on that one. Let them have fun with it, and then kind of the main plot's just going. And now you've got this new plot, like where they've got this
Yeah.
goblin army that when they eventually do face the big bad evil genius at the end, they can come back and go to Boblin, hey, we're mates. Can you come and save us from ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, that would work. I do love that idea of, the world happening whether your players see it or not, because that kind of does make it feel like there's so much that could be happening and could be that's not seen till later, etc., which gives you a much fuller world, or feels like it anyway. I wondered if we should just quickly go through some of the questions we got and make sure we've covered out some of those details.
Yes.
So we got questions from a few people, including Rooney and Hedge. So the first question we had was how much of the world do you build out, and how granular do you get with the details, which you've kind of covered.
Yeah, I'd like to talk to the granular element because I think that's it's one of those things where one of those things was like, ooh, I don't know. Different people approach this in different ways, and it's very much down to what gives you passion and makes you happy, because you are always going to write things that you are excited about. Whether your players enjoy it in the same way or not is often a question which you can have with them through session zeros and things like that. Lydia is really, really good at small details about food, fashion, and society. It's a key passion of hers. It's one of the reasons that Wicked Game, all the Wicked Game streams have really big elements of those that pop up, even if it's not like the Lighthouse of Isidros was very far from that, but there's those elements. I'm more interested in things like geopolitics and stuff like that. So a lot of that will feed back. And I like whimsy. I'm a big fan of whimsy. So
Yeah.
I will probably spend less detail on what are the local politics like and much more on there's a cluster of dragons that only exist in this world and they're really friendly. I do go down to things like Cobalt Spit, stroke Dragon's Fire, the alcohol that is we keep referring to, and that is kind of a key element. And it's one of those things that the reason that is kind of important is it exists on both sides of the economics scale. Everybody can get hold of it.
But they call it different
But they
things.
call it different things so they can charge different money for it. But it's the same kobold moonshine. It's just
But a different packaging.
but a
Yeah, we
different
definitely know
packaging.
that one
Yeah.
too. But I do like the idea of things that are that can be callbacks in
Yeah.
other places of the world, or that you can refer to events that people know about in different places, because it does build those kind of like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
moments, which I think is really lovely.
Yeah. And so I think the answer to that is as granular as you want to be, but don't give yourself too much work.
Well, I guess
pretty
if
much.
you are starting or you're just in one place, you could do it kind of granular for that space rather than trying to do the whole world.
Yeah. And Rooney, you're right. Lydia apologizes way too much for including those elements. That's her form of storytelling, and we're all here for that. So
And it builds amazing, like I say,
yeah,
but it builds such a believable
yeah.
world and history.
And I will never stop telling her off for apologizing for that because she shouldn't, because it's
Yeah.
brilliant.
So another question Rooney had was, how do you balance a level of realism and believability with the kind of, it's like this because magic and cool, which is always a kind of danger,
Yeah,
and it comes back to that like big red button type feel. Like you don't want things to happen that are just ridiculous if
yeah,
you're trying to create a world that feels real.
yeah. Make sure. I guess it's a bit of a tricky one, particularly with high fantasy, which of course is what we deal with most.
Mostly, yeah.
Be consistent with your rules is the answer to that, and make sure that's a. I mean, that's a good rule for DMs in general. Like, be consistent. If you create a situation whereby there is this high magic that works in a particular way, make sure it works in that particular way for everybody, unless there's a very specific reason why it doesn't, which could be a plot point. But
Well, the Lydia's treatment of magic in Wicked Games,
yes,
I
yeah,
think, is a brilliant example of that. Like the fact that there are consequences.
yeah, and it's actually something we've discussed as well. Like anyone from Lydia's world that arrived in the Scattered Land would be horrified. Magic and science go very much hand in hand in Erevis. They have worked together for a long time, but for them, technology is this complete abhorrent evil that kind of led to much damage and destruction in Lydia's world. In our world, it's the opposite. High magic without control caused what happened to the Scattered Lands. So although their magic is still part of the world because magic keeps everybody safe from the AL below, there is still a price and a watch on how much magic people accumulate and things like that. It's not something we've come across yet, but it is something that will be addressed as you guys get more powerful.
But I did think that was a really nice kind of twist on this idea that there is all this powerful magic. However,
Yes.
it can literally drive you mad.
Yeah, I love
I
that.
thought that was such an interesting way of approaching magic in a world that is essentially about magic. So I loved that.
Yeah, I think Lydia's consequences is a very good way to ground something a little bit more realism. Consequences are always a very good way to kind of set a boundary on particularly things like magic and stuff.
Yeah.
If you have ever played any of the World of Darkness games, all of those games you play an immensely powerful creature, but there is a limitation on what you do. For example, we'll stay with magic. Mages, you can literally bend reality to your will. The problem is the world does not want to be bent to its will, bent to your will, and will fight you. And if you lose that fight, you will be scarred by your own magic in weird and wonderful ways. And it's really interesting, and it's one of those mechanics I've always loved.
I guess that is one of the things that makes everything feel more real and believable, is that there is risk and there are consequences.
Going back to Don's game, there were no 9th level spells by the time we finished it because the consequences of what other people had done to the world before us. There's all sorts of little tiny things you can do that would be quite interesting, and it could actually be interesting like plot points for players to investigate. Theo does not like the idea of no 9th level spells.
I think everyone's slightly unnerved by your discussions about the Sky Shield. Yes,
But the Sky Shield's a really good example. Like the Sky Shield works. People didn't know how it works, and you are literally finding out how it works. So that's the realism. It's like, oh, these islands float. There's a reason they float, and you are about to discover what it is.
Also, I guess it's that feeling of, again, stuff that we've just kind of accepted as normal.
Yeah.
And then suddenly going, but why?
Yeah, and then suddenly you had the situation where you had to start asking those questions, and it is almost like that whole sort of Truman Show situation. Like, not that you're kind of the exact, but where it's like, oh no, wait, my world is not the way I thought it was.
Yeah, which is always interesting for plots.
Yeah, absolutely.
So another question we have is, how do you handle when players ask questions about parts of the world that you hadn't considered yet?
If you're not doing it on stream, you can ask for some time.
True.
And you can ask for some time on stream as well. Like if you haven't prepared something, and best will in the world, there are always going to be things that come out of left field. You can either make something up on the spot, particularly if it feels right, and then
make a note of it.
But make a note of it, because I'm very good at DM's notes. But always make a caveat with people, like a case of, okay, well, this is what I currently think. But if you're playing at home, kind of make a note that you need to investigate that and go, say, hey, can I give that to you in downtime? Like, I don't have that answer for me. If it's not particularly necessary particularly if it's not necessary for that immediate moment, can I have 5 minutes to think on that? And I'll come back to you.
Well, and I guess, I think you said this to me before, the player may not know what that's like. So if they ask about an area that they haven't been to, if you don't know, then actually it might be the case that you could just say, well, does your player know? Have they been there? If not, roll for your history or whatever and kind of buffer it that way while it gives you a bit of space.
History, for going back to D&D, and you were particularly talking about history rolls. History rolls are only based on what that character has directly engaged with. If it's something that exists out of their world entirely, and even if they roll like a 28, you can kind of say, you can do the whole sort of, well, I can give you some loose information, but unfortunately, even with that roll, and it sounds really mean, but it's even with that roll, all you've got is hints and rumours.
Well, I guess, the roll is not about sort of clairvoyance and knowledge of everything that exists. So even a high roll, if you have not been there, you don't know.
Yeah. And Hedge has just kind of given me away. Make them roll and give you some time to think. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, make them
totally. Or distract them with shiny hats and pastries. Yes. Flash had a question which said, interesting for you, Chris, in terms of like some of the hero stuff particularly, what is one part of homebrewing a world that you didn't expect you'd be making?
I didn't expect to have to come up with 400 types of bread in one session. I loved it. I loved that session, but and I will be completely honest, 95% of the Twilight market I made up on the spot, and I really cannot remember everything that I did. I need to go back and watch that episode properly, but when you're just like, I genuinely thought you were going to spend more time with Mallory and less time doing this.
No, we saw sweets and bread. I need to figure out what sweets I bought as well, because you were naming those off the top of your head, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I was literally making that up. I kind of had it this loose thing. It's like, and you can go over here, and I was like, and as soon as you kind of engage with it, I was like, I need to make this more interesting. This is more interesting. This is a Fey market. It's going to be one of the weirdest and most wonderful things that you've ever encountered. And
oh my God! Sorry, Rooney just reminded me of the screaming goldfish. Well, after we'd done that, I said to Chris, what was that? Why was there a goldfish screaming in a bowl? It was the most disturbing thing. And he was like, I don't know.
I mean, there is a thought behind it. It's like, again, it is actually going back to Rooney's question about making like consequences for rules. Just because a child says, "I want to awaken my goldfish," doesn't mean the goldfish is a good thing to awaken.
True.
It's like
Up
it was just
until
like,
then, it couldn't remember where it was 5 seconds
yeah,
ago.
exactly. Let's just give this goldfish sentience. What's a goldfish's experience? Oh my god, life is horrible. I am literally drowning and living. It's like,
That was terrifying.
and funny.
It was, but it was
Yeah.
terrifying. Pat has asked, how much of a world do you plan before session 0 and how much after?
I personally plan a setting idea, what the world's going to be like, and I might create a few locations. I'll then have a session 0, which, by the way, anyone in chat who isn't familiar, session 0 is a pre-game meeting where you don't necessarily role play. But what you do is you talk through what the game's going to be about. You touch on things like themes. You engage in safety tools for making sure that everyone kind of clearly states what they can and cannot deal with in game. You can do things like a little bit of world building. So I tend to do an individual chat with each of my players if I can, and then I try and get everyone together before a session just to kind of talk through what we're doing and things like that. And it kind of sounds like a lot of admin, but it's really worth doing because actually you come up with so many wonderful ideas when your player's like, "Here's my backstory," and you read it through and go, "Oh, wow, this is amazing. Can we expand upon this? Tell me about these things. Tell me about these people." So I will create a small element, and sometimes the players will come along with ideas and I'll push them into the element because it fits. And sometimes I'm like, this will create something over here, so I'll make a note and we'll go over there at some point. So I think
That makes sense.
yeah.
Also, he asked, is it easier to give players established lore or give them a looser set of lore that they can mold to their liking?
It's easier to give them a looser set of lore that they can mold to their liking, and then what you can do is you can work on the actual lore behind. So again, there's that whole thing about preconceptions versus reality.
So what they think they know versus what you actually create as fact in the world.
Yeah, and it's kind of, and be honest with your players about this. If you're going to do this technique, is when use terms like "as far as you know," what you understand is, don't say this is what it is like. Because when you come along and say, actually, this is what it's like, they're kind of going to go, but you lied to me. But if you say things like, as far as you know, this is what is going on, it kind of eases that. So kind of make sure, and then kind of make sure that you're having that discussion with your players as well. Like everything that your characters involve is their perception on things. Things might change as they grow into themselves.
Yeah. Another question was, are world maps essential to a long form campaign? I think we kind of touched on this loosely, but
yeah, we did a little bit. They are really helpful. Yes, I am very light on maps, and I often, to my detriment, as I said about Chris and distances. But to start with, have a general idea, and it doesn't need to be. I mean, do pop past Incarnate and have a look at their wonderful tools.
We will put their link as well in the PDF because it's very cool to play with. You can lose days playing with the map builder.
It's really, really good, really good fun. Do have a look. Do use those sorts of tools to create interesting and wonderful things. Then don't be held by them, because remember, your world's going to evolve as you start telling your story as well. And once your players come in, they kind of go, you might introduce a new character and you're like, and they want to find out more. Well, okay, they come from this village. This village doesn't exist on your map yet. Where does it go? Who does it belong? How close is it? What's there? You get all these new questions. So having a loose map idea, like north, south, this is over here, this is over here, this is over here, this is over here, is a really good place to start. And then as you progress through your story, as your story fleshes out, so does the map. because it becomes.
Well, and I guess if you also know on the map, if you're like, okay, well, north is going to be where the icy tundra is, then if somebody says, oh, well, I came from an icy fishing village, then you know that's going to be north of wherever they are.
Yeah.
So you can actually then place things in the general region that it fits in.
Yeah. Or if you suddenly find out that icy fishing village is 30 miles south of the desert that you kind of created, you suddenly have a very new reason for why they need to go there and have a look at what's going on.
And a lot of explaining. And the last question we do have is plot before world building or vice versa?
Oh, themes before either. I think so. You know what you're building for.
That makes sense to me. Like having someone who's building something really new for the first time. I think that idea of building the themes first feels a little less daunting than the plot or the world, which feels really big.
Come up with your themes and setting, and then you can sit down to do both plot and world building off the back of those, and they will be better for you because you feel like you've got a grounding on what you're creating. Yeah.
That makes sense.
That was awesome. Yes.
I think that's pretty much all the questions that we've got, and we've gone over an hour by a bit. So I think we will wrap it up for tonight. But
yes,
thank you. That's really helpful, and I have no doubt I will have 900 million more questions as I build a new world in your world. And thank you everybody for sending through your questions. If you have any further questions, please just drop us a DM or something, and I will field them to Chris to answer.
I might start doing TikToks. Who knows?
And thank you everybody for joining us today. Really appreciate it. It's honestly just means the world, and we want to try and do whatever we can to help people get into the game and enjoy the game and make it as accessible as possible, because we think it should be.
Do you want to tell the lovely people what we have coming up over the next couple of weeks, Wayne?
Indeed, I do. So in the next couple of weeks, we have 2 more Space at the Tables.
What, 2 more, you say, Wayne? That's impossible.
We have a really exciting sort of episode coming up where we're going to be discussing game design and building an actual game with the wonderful Ersi Dice, who they are going to come on and talk to us about their game that has just been launched. The pre-orders, I believe, have launched.
They are, yes. If you give me 1 second, if you'd all just like to roll an intelligence check for me
to give Chris some time. So they're going to be coming on. We're going to be talking about game building, how you build a game, how you even start putting something like that together, and what the kind of ins and outs and intricacies are, building something that works for people. So that's going to be very, very cool. And we also, next week, Chris and I are going to be doing a second part of our discussion about the new Unearthed Arcana coming out as part of the 1D&D materials that they are releasing every couple of weeks. So we will be discussing that next week, where they're talking about the expert classes and some of the changes they've made to some of the classes, and some of them are really, really cool. I am a little undecided on what they've done with Bard, but I'm still trying to figure out the whys behind that, because as always, Chris is analysing it, and I'm going, why?
They took my toy away, Wayne.
So next week we'll be discussing that part 2 of the 1D&D test materials. And of course, please remember that they are opening up the questionnaire for you to feed back on the test materials.
Yeah.
So please do, and make sure that they know how cool it's going to be.
Yeah.
And then we have more Space at the Tables coming up, where we will be discussing issues like trans representation in TTRPGs. We will also be discussing 3-dimensional and more interesting spaces at the table created for and by women, which we're going to be talking about, and we've got a few other special ones lined up a little further away, including a DM's round table with the wonderful DMs of some other heroes, Dice and Slice and Wicked Game, who will be telling us all of their secrets so that we can make notes and win.
No. More like the 3 of us will just walk away with more evil things we can do to our respective groups.
Yeah, that's probably more likely. So all exciting stuff coming up. So please, if you think anybody would find this helpful, please share the Twitch channel, and it'll be available tomorrow on YouTube. So we'd really appreciate it if you would share it. It's just means the world to us, and it's so much more exciting for us to get people following us and people watching our stuff that come through people we already know are wonderful.
Yeah. Speaking
So
of which, if you are about in, say, 35 minutes' time, the wonderful Hedgehog in chat will be streaming his own TTRPG campaign. I'm just going to drop his link in chat. If you are able, please do drop past. Hedge is a lovely person. He's been incredibly supportive to this community. He's a wonderful man. I've actually played with him. He joined me for the Roll for Good campaign I did
which was
earlier this
fun.
year, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
He's a lovely guy. So please go and support him, see what he's up to, and yeah.
So we've got some exciting stuff coming up, though.
Yes, we have lots of exciting things. I'm really, really cool. And of course, we are back this Sunday with some other heroes